Chapter 13. During the month we had passed on board the Tiger, General Desaix and Monsieur Poussilgue held several conferences with Sir Sidney Smith, which left upon their minds an impression of ill omen. General Desaix might be deemed excusable for erring in negotiations of a diplomatic nature, never having been employed on such missions. This excuse, however, could not be pleaded in favor of his colleague, who had been the diplomatic agent of the Republic of Genoa, and yet so blind was the confidence which had involved them in the situation in which they found themselves that Sir Sidney Smith was not even requested to exhibit the powers he ought to have from his government and from the Turks, on behalf of whom he pretended to stipulate a treaty. He acted with so much dexterity that he was not asked the question. This neglect on the part of the French plenipotentiaries was more than Sir Sidney Smith could have anticipated. It is moreover probable that he had expected a more cautious conduct, and that from the very first communications between General Kleber and the Vizier, he had applied to his government for instructions and powers in anticipation of the event which he foresaw was at hand, and was yet without an answer in consequence of that event having occurred sooner than he expected. 2 days after Sir Sidney Smith's departure from Jaffa, where he had left General Desaix and Monsieur Poussilgue, his secretary arrived there on a mission from him with several Turkish officers and a pass in order to conduct the plenipotentiaries to the Vizier's camp. They accordingly immediately left for Gaza, slept the next night at Ramla on the border of the desert, and reached El Arish at an early hour the next morning. The Vizier had caused some very handsome tents to be pitched at a spot separated from the camp, and a guard had been placed there for the special purpose of protecting the plenipotentiaries, for whose accommodation those tents were intended. He sent to compliment them on their arrival and to present to them as a mark of his high esteem a pitcher of water from Gaza and about a dozen choice white apples. Our being in a desert could alone account for such objects being deemed worthy of acceptance. Sir Sidney Smith's tent was placed near ours, and he had with him some English marines brought from on board his ship. After a few days' rest, the first conference was opened with the Vizier's plenipotentiaries, and it had well nigh been the last, for General Desaix was in a perfect rage when he left it. It had been found impossible to make them comprehend the meaning of a suspension of arms, a capitulation, or a treaty. That Turks could only see two results arising from war. These were death or slavery, nor would they admit of any other stipulations. Monsieur Poussilgue, though more composed, was not less astonished than General Desaix at what he had just heard. They both upbraided Sir Sidney Smith in bitter terms for his not having communicated to them these dispositions on the part of the Turks, instead of assuring them, as he had done, that it was their intention to accede to a plain and simple evacuation of Egypt. General Desaix broke out in severe reproaches and intimating to Sir Sidney Smith his refusal to negotiate any further. He summoned that officer to take him instantly on board, according to what had been agreed upon between them. Sir Sidney Smith was not at all alarmed at this clamor. He was better acquainted with the Turks of Europe than our plenipotentiaries were. He would not most assuredly have allowed the least injury to be done to him, but he could not be sorry to find his assistance indispensable towards extricating them from the difficulty they were in. He calmed the plenipotentiaries by taking all upon himself so great in fact were his exertions during the following night that on the next day he again brought the two parties together and had the conferences renewed, at which he ever afterwards assisted. By his unheard of activity, he caused the conditions of that famous Treaty of El Arish to be discussed, settled, and drawn up in the forms prescribed by General Kleber, thereby destroying General Bonaparte's work. Sir Sidney Smith was urging his signature because he had already learned the arrival of General Bonaparte in France, as the sequel will show. General Desaix, however, previously to signing it, recoiled with horror at the idea and had the signature put off for a few days. He sent for me at night to his tent and said, What General Kleber desired has been done. Go and tell him from me that before I can sanction the act with my signature, I wish him to read what he has made us agree to, but that in no case shall I sign without an order from him, of which I request you to be the bearer. I returned accordingly to Egypt with an escort of Tartars, who made me cross through the vizier's army and joined General Kleber at Selhiye, where he had united the army. Upon hearing of the capture of El Arish and the arrival of the Turkish army at that point, I entered just after the holding of a council of war in which the discussion had turned upon the impossibility of preserving Egypt. And General Kleber had not disdained to provide himself with a guarantee as a relief to his responsibility by making all the generals sign a declaration wherein, after the statement laid before them, they acknowledged the impossibility of defending Egypt with the means which the army had at command. Opinions had not been unanimous in this council, as, however, the object of returning to France was flattering to all. They signed in a body because in this case no one could be singled out for censure. I announced to General Kleber that at the moment of my departure, intelligence was brought to the camp of El Arish of General Bonaparte's arrival in France, and I handed to him a file of newspapers which already noticed the event. I twice repeated the message which General Desaix had specially directed me to command to him. General Kleber again assembled a council of war in order to communicate to it the contents of the dispatches I had brought, and made me return the same night in a cartel with an answer for General Desaix and the order to sign the treaty which he had desired me to bring to him. General Kleber also charged me to claim the wife of a sergeant of the garrison of El Arish, whom he knew to have fallen to the share of a pasha, being desirous, it he said, not to leave behind him a single individual belonging to the army. Before my departure, General Davout, one of those who opposed the decision of the council, drew me aside and desired me to tell General Desaix what had taken place, that the members of the council had only signed out of complaisance to General Kleber, who had succeeded in deceiving them, but that if General Desaix would refuse signing the treaty, all the generals in the army would side with him. I had been too many years acquainted with General Davout to doubt the truth of what he said to me, but I observed that the communication was of too serious a nature for me to make otherwise than by being the bearer of a letter from him, adding that if he felt sufficient dependence upon me to transmit a verbal message, he could safely entrust me with a written one, that in any case I would execute his commission, but was prepared for the observation General Desaix would not fail to make to me, as he would be very justly disappointed at not seeing the above hints committed to writing, and that from all that had happened he could not run any risk. I instantly departed for El Arish. On arriving at the Turkish advanced posts, I received an escort which conducted me to the vizier's tent, round which were strewed the bodies of wretches who had been put to death during the day. I found Sir Sidney Smith with the vizier and seized that opportunity to claim the woman I have mentioned. I then learned from the vizier that he had given her to the Pasha of Jerusalem, but he said he would ask for her back and immediately sent her on to us. I went thence to Sir Sidney Smith to General Desaix's tent, where the treaty was signed on the night of my arrival. Upon my executing General Davout's commission, General Desaix replied to me in these words: "What, is it possible Davout could have directed you to give me this message when I see his name at the foot of the deliberation which all have signed and which you have brought to me? It were blamable in me to rely upon such men, happen what may. The die is cast. This business has caused me uneasiness enough, but there has been no fault of mine." On the next day, or the day following, both parties took leave of each other. Just as General Desaix was about to start on his return to Egypt, a letter was brought to him from Jerusalem, and it was from the poor woman, who thanked him for the interest he had shown in her fate, but declared that it was not her intention to take advantage of it, as she found herself well off and was resolved to remain where she was. She wished us success and a happy journey. Well satisfied with what had taken place, Sir Sidney Smith left us in order to search the archipelago for vessels which the Turks stood in need of for the transport of the army. He was to bring them to Alexandria, where very few were remaining of those that had brought us over to Egypt, they having been successfully broken up to meet the wants of the army. Sir Sidney Smith, who, although without any powers, had so well served his country by taking advantage of our credulity, had reason to expect that his government would approve of his proceedings. The contrary, however, was the case. Conformably to the conditions of the treaty, the Turkish army advanced to occupy Ketiye, between El Arish and Slahiye, and also Slahiye and Damietta, and these towns were delivered up to them before the arrival of any one of the transports which ought already to have reached Alexandria, so that we were resigning our advantages without receiving any equivalent. This circumstance was so mortifying to General Desaix that on his rejoining the army, he expressed his desire to avail himself of the permission given him to return to France. General Kleber did not feel himself warranted in refusing him, and at his request allowed him to embark on board the vessel that had brought over Messieurs de Livron and Hamelin, as those gentlemen had freighted her with return goods, and she would be the first to put to sea. General Desaix also asked for another small vessel, which was likewise ready, and permission to take home General Davout, who would no longer remain in Egypt with General Kleber. The latter, though he had reason to be displeased with Davout's conduct, had just appointed him a general division. But whether it was owing to bitterness of feeling or to a manly pride, Davout had refused the appointment, unwilling, as he said, to date his promotion from so disgraceful an epoch. General Kleber, who could not feel otherwise than vexed at such a refusal, took no other revenge than that of allowing him to depart. He returned to Salahiye, to Cairo, with General Desaix, who remained but a few days at the latter place on his way to Alexandria. Kleber was bringing back the army, and he arrived at Cairo at the moment when a summary of the events of the 18th Brumaire had reached that city. A brig of war from Toulon had just anchored in the Bay of Damietta and sent her boat ashore with General Galbaud and his son, whom General Bonaparte had dispatched to Egypt. Finding that our troops had evacuated Damietta in the morning, the boat proceeded up the river in order to land General Galbaud close to our nearest military station and returned to overtake its ship, which it could no longer find. The fact is that owing to the protracted absence of the boat, the sloop of war had sent another boat on shore to ascertain what had become of the first, and that boat, finding the Turks in possession of Damietta, which they came to occupy since the first boat had passed it, no longer doubted either that it was lost or had ascended the Nile until it could come up with our troops. When the commander of the brig heard the account brought by the second boat, he took fright, weighed anchor, sailed back to France, and succeeded in entering Toulon, so that the missing boat, not finding its ship in the bay, had been under the necessity of making the best of its way to Alexandria, where it had recently arrived. General Galbaud brought the first intelligence of the event, which had transferred the power to General Bonaparte's hands. This news was not calculated to allay the fears of those who had thought they would only have to account to the Directory for their conduct. General Galbaud had not reached Cairo when General Desaix went to take leave of General Kleber previously to his departure for Alexandria. They appeared to meet on terms of cordiality, and General Kleber felt persuaded that General Desaix, on his arrival in France, would not prejudice General Bonaparte against him. He even flattered himself that he might rely upon him in a circumstance so deeply affecting his future prospect. I took my departure with General Desaix, who proceeded by the Nile as far as Rosetta, where he went to see General Menou, who was furious at the evacuation of Egypt. Our boats proceeded from the Nile by sea to Alexandria, and we cut across the country because General Desaix was desirous of visiting the fort of Aboukir and all that part of the coast. We passed the night in a trading caravansary, annoyed beyond description by swarms of vermin, which are brought thither by caravans on their way through, and we were beginning to load our camels the next morning in order to repair to Alexandria when, from a sandy hillock, we descried in the offing a vessel with lateen sails, apparently of a most diminutive size. She was endeavoring to reach the shore on which we stood, and from the whiteness of her sails and the position in which she appeared, we guessed that she was not an Egyptian vessel. Curiosity got the better of us, and we determined to wait for her, whatever inconvenience we might afterwards suffer from the heat on continuing our journey. We were able to hail her at the expiration of 2 hours and learned that she was on her way from Toulon with a colonel on board who was going to join the army with dispatches for the commander-in-chief. The vessel accordingly landed Monsieur Victor de la Tour Malberg who gave us the details of the 18th Brumaire and immediately proceeded to join General Kleber at Cairo. Taking the road we had just traveled over, we proceeded on our way to Alexandria. When we left General Kleber, he was very far from entertaining the slight suspicion of the deplorable issue which would, in a few days, terminate the negotiations he had so hastily ventured upon. But a bitter disappointment was shortly to come upon him. The first circumstance mentioned to us by General Lanuza, who commanded at Alexandria, in which he had communicated to General Kleber on the preceding day, unfolded to our view what was likely to occur. The explanation of this circumstance must be prefaced by an account of previous circumstances. The Theseus, after proceeding to Cyprus for the purpose of undergoing repairs, had come back to resume its cruising station off Alexandria, where the passing event had rendered the communications with that ship more frequent than the ordinary course of the service occasionally required to be kept up. The captain of the ship had apprised General Lanuza that Sir Sidney Smith had sent him Turkish passes ready, signed, to be delivered to the vessels that might sail from Egypt in consequence of the Treaty of El Arish, and that he would give up as many as might be demanded of him. The officer sent by General Lanuza to return thanks to the captain of the Theseus happened to be on board that ship at the very moment of the arrival before Alexandria of a cutter dispatched from England to Sir Sidney Smith. This cutter, called the Bulldog, had orders to proceed in all haste, and the captain brought instructions and powers to enable Sir Sidney Smith to treat respecting the evacuation of Egypt. But whether the English government was under a false impression in regard to the position of our army, or a delusion had been created by the successes of the Allied armies over our troops in Italy, that government would not grant any other terms to the French army than to be made prisoners of war. Previously to sailing in quest of Sir Sidney Smith in the archipelago, the commander of the cutter communicated his instructions to the captain of the Theseus, who, by the return of the French officer, was sent corresponding message to General Lanuza. No time was therefore left for taking advantage of the Treaty of El Arish, except the interval that would elapse before Sir Sidney Smith could be overtaken by the Bulldog and could revoke the first orders he had given to the Theseus, and issue counter orders, the course which it was reasonably apprehended he would adopt. General Desaix, who was furious at the bare contemplation of the misfortunes which he saw thickening around us, felt the utmost impatience to turn to account the short respite we had left, the rather so, as he felt some apprehension from all he had witnessed that Kleber, after having placed himself at the mercy of the English, would submit to all their terms without drawing his sword, whereas no consideration in the world would make him stipulate for the surrender of the army. He sent me the next morning on board the Theseus with directions to do all in my power to remove the difficulties that might be thrown in the way of his departure, owing perhaps to the merchandise belonging to Monsieur Hamelin shipped on board the vessel in which he intended to return to France. In the contrary case, he would engage another vessel. I found the captain of the Theseus a very worthy, accommodating man, disposed to follow up the orders given to him by Sir Sidney Smith, regardless of the non-official communication made to him by the commander of the Bulldog. He accordingly delivered to me a license for General Desaix and all those who were to return with him. He even carried his attention so far as to send with me one of the officers of his ship, whom he gave us as a safeguard, and directed to embark in our vessels and see us safe to France. I have since had a suspicion that his conduct was not altogether disinterested, and that he would have gone much farther to effect the removal of General Desaix. I returned to Alexandria, where General Desaix anxiously awaited my return. He seemed much pleased to find that the sea was left open to him, and that he might safely undertake the voyage. He did not trifle with this piece of good fortune, for he sailed the next day. I break off for the present from the account of what relates to General Desaix, and return to General Kleber. The Bulldog cutter overtook Sir Sidney Smith, who came back to his station before Alexandria, and wrote to General Kleber, assuring him of the sincere distress he felt at having to communicate to him the conditions upon which his government would alone ratify the Treaty of El Arish. He admitted what could no longer be doubted, that he had certainly acted without powers, though under the conviction that his government would approve his conduct, and he had now the mortification to acknowledge that he was mistaken. He entreated General Kleber not to permit what now occurred to prejudice him in his opinion, protesting as he did that he was no party to it. This was very credible. The upshot of all this was that we were under the necessity of giving battle to the Turks as soon as possible, and so crown our past operations by the step which ought to have preceded them. The battle was fought on the ruins of Heliopolis in the vicinity of Cairo. The Turks were defeated and dispersed, but having succeeded in reaching the borders of the desert, they contrived to extend their line of march beyond the right of our army and threw themselves in numbers into Cairo. Kleber now resumed that character which, for the sake of his army and of his own glory, he never should have laid aside. In a few days he drove back beyond the deserts of Asia those hordes which were tenfold more numerous than his own forces, recovered all the places he had imprudently evacuated, and returned to besiege Cairo, where a pasha had taken up his quarters with some 30,000 men. It became necessary to carry on a destructive war from house to house, and in the end to allow the pasha to retire unmolested before the latter could be prevailed upon to quit the town and retreat into Asia with his troops. No price, however, was too great that would put an end to a destruction of lives, which, considering the position of the army, was daily proving more fatal in its consequences. General Kleber was thus compelled, as if against his own will, to remain in Egypt, owing to the folly of his enemies. He candidly admitted his error and saw that his plan of evacuating Egypt had cost him more men than General Bonaparte had lost in establishing himself in that country, or than he himself would have lost if he had adopted a different course. His conduct altered from that moment. He no longer deceived himself either as to the opinion he might succeed in impressing upon the government, or the judgment that might be passed respecting what he might have done, what he actually had done, and what he ought not to have done. His endeavors thenceforward were directed to the object of repairing the errors he had fallen into, trusting to time and to the magnanimity of General Bonaparte for obliterating every trace of that painful period of his career. Whilst General Kleber was recovering possession of Egypt, General Desaix was crossing the Mediterranean and was on the point of entering Toulon when he was taken by an English frigate, which carried him to Leghorn, where Admiral Keith's ship was at anchor. The latter, whose instructions were conformable to those sent to Sir Sidney Smith by the Bulldog, declared General Desaix a prisoner and confiscated the vessel. General Desaix, who had embarked on the faith of a treaty with a license and escorted by an English commissioner, claimed to be taken back to Egypt if he was not permitted to land in France. Notwithstanding the justice of this demand, a month was suffered to elapse before he was informed that he was at liberty to return to France on board the same vessel, the cargo of which had been previously removed. Chapter 14. We had returned on board this vessel when another brought us Monsieur Poussilk, who had also sailed for France. We had left him at Cairo, where he was foremost amongst those who wished for the return of the army to France. We were at a loss to account for the motives which had induced him to hasten his departure from Egypt. He sailed in our company. We steered our course towards Provence and were almost immediately hailed by an enemy's brig. But being provided with a pass from Admiral Keith, the brig sailed off and we got into Toulon. Those who have never left their country cannot know the feeling which is experienced on returning to it after a long absence. We were in a kind of mental aberration for 3 days, running in every direction and perfectly restless. General Desaix found it a matter of some difficulty to retain us near his person for the purpose of copying the dispatches he was writing to General Bonaparte on the subject of past events. We felt no other inclination than to walk in the park of the Lazaretto. General Desaix received by return of courier a reply from General Bonaparte. Monsieur Poussilk, on the contrary, was left without any. This continued to be the case for the whole duration of the quarantine we had to perform I returned to General Bonaparte, having afterwards already related how his departure was effected. I come to the details of his voyage. I have already mentioned that there was no cruiser before Alexandria at the time of his setting sail. He reached Corsica in safety. Being ignorant of the existing state of parties in France, he felt it necessary to obtain intelligence, and yet was at a loss how to elude the quarantine laws. His perplexity was relieved by the impatience of his fellow countrymen to see him. The report having spread that General Bonaparte was on board, the peasantry and townspeople were desirous of conveying to him the expression of their homage. Yielding to the general enthusiasm, the municipal administration gave way, entered a boat, and proceeded in the direction of the Muiron, thus infringing those laws which it was its special duty to enforce. The quarantine regulations were laid aside. General Bonaparte landed at Ajaccio, but only remained there the time requisite for collecting all necessary information and resumed his voyage. The ship was in full sail when Gatillon came to inform him that enemy's ships were descried from the topmasts, and to receive his orders. General Bonaparte, after reflecting for a moment, desired him to trust wholly to chance until the hour of midnight. The admiral continued his course towards Toulon. The cruisers were lost sight of in the night, and no vessel appeared in the offing the following morning. The English, who had only to watch Toulon, which no longer contained any ships of war, and Marseille, whence supplies were forwarded to the army of Italy, kept within the Gulf of Lyons. Their whole squadron had assembled at that station because those ports were the only two landing points for vessels attempting to penetrate into France. The cruisers off Corsica were on the lookout for vessels endeavoring to reach that island, but neglected to watch those sailing from it for the coast of Provence. Relying upon the difficulty they would find in eluding the vigilance of the fleet, this was the cause of their not giving chase to the two frigates. General Bonaparte arrived at last within sight of the French coast, and unfortunately at the approach of night the sun had just set, leaving behind a train of light which was reflected back by the starry heavens. The frigates beyond the reach of this refraction were in a mixed atmosphere of light and darkness, growing more intense in proportion as it receded. From the midst of this light, the English squadron was visible to the naked eye. It consisted of 15 sail, stationed before Toulon, and appeared in the center of the refraction I have just mentioned. The sea was calm indeed, but the frigates were bearing down upon that squadron. Had it not been for these rays of light, they would have been in total darkness and persisted in their course, and would have most undoubtedly got into the very midst of the squadron on the springing up of the night breeze. The frigates no sooner discovered their danger than they tacked about, escaping under favor of the night, steered towards Nice, and reached Fréjus the next morning. They were at first mistaken for enemy's ships and fired upon, but no sooner was it known that General Bonaparte was on board than prolonged acclamations were heard in every direction. Had he dropped from the skies, his appearance could not have created more surprise or enthusiasm. The people became frantic with joy and revolted at the bare mention of quarantine regulations. The Board of Health, the land and naval officers, all hurried pell-mell into the boats. Hardly any sea room was left for the frigates, which were hailed from every corner. The scene at Corsica was again renewed. Public impatience broke through the quarantine laws. It was no longer optional with General Bonaparte to resist the acclamations of a people who welcomed him as their liberator. The population continued flocking to the shore. He thanked them for the expressions of their good wishes and for their offers of service, and prepared to remove himself from a coast where, under pretense of sanitary precautions, his enemies might detain him or throw serious obstacles in his way. He therefore availed himself of the first carriage out of the numbers that were brought to him from all quarters, and took the road to Grenoble. He traveled night and day. Lyons was intoxicated with joy at his arrival. He alighted at the Hôtel de Célestin. The quays were soon encumbered by crowds, rending the air with their acclamations, and able to resist their anxiety to behold him. He repeatedly presented himself before them. The report of his arrival had spread with the rapidity of lightning. The road from Lyons to Paris was covered with people who were eager to obtain a glimpse of him. He evaded these marks of attention, hastened his journey, and actually arrived at Paris and reached his residence at the Rue de la Victoire before the government had been aware of his landing at Fréjus. He proceeded to the Luxembourg the same day. He wore a gray frock and a Mameluke saber suspended by a silk twist in the Oriental style. He was recognized as he passed along, and the report of his arrival spread in an instant from one end of the metropolis to the other. The population flocked in crowds around his hotel. It was a continued scene of hurry and congratulations. All rejoiced at possessing at last the man who was to stop the course of our disasters. Matters had, in fact, assumed a most deplorable aspect. Massena had undoubtedly arrested the progress of the Russians in Zurich. The English, who had landed in Friesland, had been defeated at Castricum and were preparing to evacuate the continent, a retreat they effected a few days after General Bonaparte's arrival. The external positions of the Republic had improved. Not so, however, its internal condition. The army of Italy, which had been driven back to the territory of Genoa after repeated defeats, was no longer adequate to protect Provence, now threatened by the Austrians. The civil war, more animated than any former period, was spreading its ravages over the western and southern departments. The power of the law had fallen into abeyance, and the administration was without energy. Parties, the most opposed in political sentiments, had united to overthrow a government so totally lost in public opinion. Every species of credit was destroyed by this distressing state of affairs. The public funds had fallen to 17 francs, and yet the only resource of government was in bonds and notes of hand to meet the demands with which it was assailed. From this picture, some idea may be formed of the expenses of the war and the public administration. We were arrested by precipices in every direction. Agents were employed by foreign countries to create disturbances in France, and did so with impunity from the heart of the capital, where they fearlessly carried on their intrigues. There was an end to all secrecy. Public measures were no sooner planned that they became the talk of everyone. The state was falling to ruins. Pillage and corruption seemed the order of the day. To govern had become impossible. To obey, almost unavailing. There appeared no remedy for the evil. None dared to probe the depth of it. General Bonaparte was the object of every hope and every wish. All France called loudly for him. He heard the voice, but it required the genius of such a man not to feel intimidated at the magnitude of the enterprise. The state of dejection was such as to revive the pretensions of the party known by the name of the faction of Orleans, which had again conceived the design of raising the son of that prince to supreme power. An emissary had even been sent after him to England, where he resided. The answer was unsatisfactory. He refused to promote his own elevation unless the elder branch of his family were to disclaim all opposition to it, which under existing circumstances it was not possible to expect. The faction was far from anticipating such a scruple. It was not, however, disconcerted by it, and determined to call a prince of the Spanish branch to the throne. Meanwhile, General Bonaparte made his appearance, and that project was abandoned. The state of uneasiness and uncertainty had disappeared. All wishes and all hopes were settled upon the victor of the pyramids. But he could only save France by possessing himself of the supreme authority. Otherwise, it were better that he had never quitted Egypt. After maturely weighing the internal state of France and its exterior condition, he determined upon the line of conduct to be pursued. The Directory were divided in opinion as to the means to be adopted for averting the storm which threatened to overwhelm them. A still greater want of unanimity prevailed in the councils, but the nation retained all its energy. It called for a deliverer who might rescue it from its present condition. A party was easily formed, and a solid basis was found whereupon to rest its efforts. All those who had acted a conspicuous part in the revolution, who had acquired national property and had to apprehend the wrath of some nobleman or emigrant of note, naturally found a rallying point in General Bonaparte. I only except from the number of few Republicans of extravagant ideas, some popular leaders, men more ambitious in their views than even conquerors. But these ardent minds, besides being considerably reduced in numerical strength, were wholly estranged from public opinion. They had long ceased to be the objects of apprehension.